Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. I'm your host, and today on the podcast, I want to continue our theme on payment methods. In the recent podcast, I shared with you why I don't cancel my credit cards every year, because now, just because I cancel my credit cards, that doesn't automatically fix all my subscriptions and things like that, because those continue even if I cancel my physical card. Today, I want to tell you why I very rarely ever even use a physical card. And that, of course, is because now I use Apple Pay. And you can use here Apple Pay or Google Pay. I happen to use Apple Pay. And I want to explain to you why I think you should as well. Now, when Apple Pay first came out, there was a lot of news and a lot of people talking about how this is more secure, this is a better method of payment. And I greeted that with quite a significant level of suspicion, as probably you did as well. But over the years, as I've come to use Apple Pay quite a lot, I have come to believe that it is indeed, in many cases, a superior model of payment. Now, recognize that when I use terms like superior, you of course need to say, well, by what metric? So, for example, Apple Pay has a number of downsides when compared to paying with cash, physical $100 bills. But then, of course, physical $100 bills have various downsides when compared with paying with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin has various downsides when compared with paying with credit cards. Every way that we could pay for something or buy something has a set of features. And those features, depending on your perspective, could be advantages or they could be disadvantages. So in this podcast, I am primarily comparing Apple Pay or Google Pay. For the sake of not being pedantic, just if you want to prefer Google Pay, just when I say Apple Pay, you just put that in there. I'm going to say Apple Pay because I don't feel like saying Apple Pay and Google Pay every single time. So in this podcast, I'm going to be comparing the benefits of Apple Pay as compared specifically to your swiping a plastic credit card. Why is Apple Pay superior to that alternative payment method? Well, put simply, it has to do with the safety of the transaction and the privacy of the transaction. Now, let's begin by talking about the information that it gets exchanged between a buyer and a seller when you swipe your credit card at a store. Used to be, by the way, that when you first had credit cards, we didn't begin with swiping because at that time, we just grabbed the numbers. And so they had a little machine. Remember those where you got click, click, back and forth, and those numbers were impressed upon a sales slip, and the numbers were run using a phone system. Then somebody smart figured out how to take those numbers and turn them into magnetic ones and zeros on a magnetic strip, and then that became the standard. Then over the years, we figured out, well, if that's good, let's go ahead and make a little computer chip into the card. And so now, of course, tap to pay is basically the global standard. The United States was a little bit behind much of the world in adapting to tap to pay. But what I have observed is over the last couple of years, especially due to the spreading of Apple Pay and Google Pay, that basically tap to pay is standard. And so now you got a little computer chip in your credit card that sends forth its signal. So what is in that signal? What is the information that gets exchanged between all of the different people involved in order to make a credit card payment? Well, the first thing, when you use a physical credit card in any form, magnetic code, insert, or tap to pay, the first thing that gets conveyed to the merchant is the credit card number. So the credit card number gets sent to the merchant and stored in the payment system of the merchant. So I have a Stripe account as a simple example. People buy things from me and I use Stripe as my payment processor. I can open up my Stripe account and I can see the credit card information from each person who has purchased something from me. Now, I don't know very much about that credit card information. In fact, many of my listeners are very smart and they use concealed debit cards that just are single-use transactions that are locked to me. And I take great joy in laughing at the funny names that they put on their email addresses and how they categorize my stuff and funny names that people use. I get a kick out of that. But every merchant has the same basic thing. You get the credit card number that was used in the transaction from the customer. And then, of course, in order to process the payment, You also get an expiration date and a CVV code, a security code that confirms that the card is legitimate. Now, in many cases, also, the merchant gets the cardholder's name and the billing address. Not always, but frequently. So in my Stripe account, I don't bother with the whole billing address, but I do need the zip code, and that's what's used to affirm it. But other merchant processors will have different ways to set that up. So when you go and you purchase something with a credit card, just assume that all of that information gets conveyed. Your credit card number, the expiration date, the CVV code for your card, the cardholder's name, and the billing address. I guess if we're going to be super technical, I shouldn't say assume every time, right? Again, because it's not always your full billing address that the merchant receives. If you go to the gas station and you tap your card to pay for gas, there is an authorization process that happens, but it doesn't happen with the full billing address billing address in that context. But it's just, that's how I think of it, is that all this information changes hands. Now, what happens if you make a transaction using Apple Pay or with Google Pay? Well, in this case, the new system that has been developed is a system called tokenization. So instead of your credit card number, Apple Pay provides to the merchant a unique encrypted number that is assigned to your device. So let's say that you wear a watch that is enabled for payments, and you also have a mobile device that is enabled for payments. In that situation, each of those devices has a unique token, but the device account number is just simply the token for your specific device. It's not tied to your credit card. Then there is a transaction-specific dynamic security code that is created, and this code replaces the use of the card's CVV security code for the transaction. In addition to that, your device will have some kind of passcode that is used for authorization, but that is exclusively used on your device. What this means is that when you pay a merchant using Apple Pay, the merchant never receives the actual credit card information. The merchant never receives your name as associated with the transaction. And the merchant never receives any of the other details. The merchant exclusively receives that token, that device account number that is assigned to your device, and a transaction-specific security code. And with that, the payment is authorized. You can see here that this will dramatically increase the safety of the transaction. How has credit card fraud happened over many years? Well, one example that is common in the U.S. American context is the running of a credit card at a restaurant. Let's say that you go out to eat. What is standard practice in the United States is you go out to eat, you get your bill at the end, you are delivered with your bill in a little leatherette case. You pull out your credit card, toss your credit card into that leatherette case, and you pass it off to the server. Server takes it up to the point of service terminal, processes your credit card there, and returns it to you for signature and tip amount. Well, in that process, that person has full access to your physical credit card. And so one common way of credit card fraud in the past happening was that the server might have a little device that just simply pulled the information from the magnetic strip. And today, again, you can pull all the information from the card. Whether or not you can use it, that would depend. I'm not aware enough of all those details, but you can clone a card, and just like anybody could take a picture with your camera of the name on the card, the account number, the CVV code, all of that stuff. And if you could figure out how to get the zip code, then now you're off to the races. It's pretty easy to engage in credit card fraud. Now, in much of the world, the way that payments are processed is at the table. And so either at the table or up front to kind of minimize this chance of fraud. And I see this happening now a lot in the United States, where now the device comes to your table, you pay for it there, and you move on. So in the old days, that was a common trajectory of credit card fraud. Apple Pay and Google Pay eliminate that. They eliminate it because instead of all of that information being able to use multiple times, the information is exclusively associated with the device. And if the thief does not have your physical device, then the thief cannot initiate other transactions. When you also recognize that each time your device requires you to verify and put in a passcode of some kind in order to use the Apple Pay system, then you can see the benefits of this. This gives you quite a lot of security of transaction, and this is fundamentally why it's a superior model of payment over the use of a credit card. Now let's turn to privacy. You can see, of course, that there are some privacy benefits. You are eliminating some of the information that can be taken by the merchant. Ordinarily, it's relatively easy for a merchant to create a customer file if he wishes to, based upon your name that's associated with your credit card. You can pull that up and see what the name is on the credit card so that you can see who spends money with me. So I can pop open my Stripe account, I can search by any name, and I can see how much money each customer has spent with me over the lifetime of my having this particular Stripe account. And any merchant can do exactly the same thing. Whereas when you pay with an Apple Pay transaction, then now the person doesn't have the easy name. You just have, again, the token information. So you can gain quite a lot of privacy from the merchant. Is that useful for you? Is that a good thing? Again, you be the judge. Maybe you want to be part of some kind of loyalty program and have all of that information available to the merchant so the merchant knows you're a big spender and treats you well. You deal with this how you like. The point is simply that you can gain additional levels of privacy over your transactions in addition to safety by using Apple Pay and Google Pay. Now, let me clarify for a moment that there are still various parties involved, and using Apple Pay doesn't create additional privacy from your bank in the transaction. Even though you have processed the transaction through Apple Pay, your credit card issuer still has all of the information on the end transaction. So there's no cutout here in terms of information that's restricted from the credit card issuer. And then now, of course, if you're thinking about safety and privacy, now remember that we've inserted a third party to the transaction. Now we have Apple or Google in the way. So you should think about what is the information that Apple Pay or Google Pay would have about you. So here you have Apple would have device information. So they receive data. Apple receives data related to the device that's being used for the transaction that's creating it. And so every transaction is now paired to your device. Apple will collect and use your location of the device. And so that's important to know that now the location of the device is tied to the transaction. And then, of course, Apple has some knowledge of the fact that a transaction has occurred. According to what they say, they have the time and the approximate amount of money, but not any particular specifics. So they don't know which merchant or the exact details of the transaction. And then Apple knows which payment network is being used for the transaction, whether it's Visa or MasterCard. They have that information. So in theory, if you wanted to play the counter argument to this, you would say, well, now Apple has more data on me. And in theory, that data can be collected and used for whatever purposes you authorize in your 574-page user agreement. Now, Apple doesn't have access to the card numbers that are on your device. And Apple says they don't retain any specific transaction information that can be tied back to you, but of course it's going to be tied to the device. And so anytime information is created, let's assume that it is stored. Probably not a big deal, but that's where things are. So if you were going to compare the safety and security and privacy of using a physical credit card as compared to using a device, I think that the device is a big winner because you now have less of a chance of fraud. Now let's turn to convenience. I think clearly this is one of the big reasons that many of us use Apple Pay or Google Pay is simply due to convenience. Having the ability to run transactions from your device means that you don't always have to have your physical cards with you. And if you are not familiar with the system, if you don't use this system, I'm trying to give you reasons to go ahead and set it up. And recognize also that you can have a very significant number of cards available to you on the device. I believe the number for Apple is 10 total cards. I have maxed it out in the past, and I think that was the number. I have never used Google Pay, but I would guess they have a similar number. What that means is you can set up 10 different cards on your Apple devices. And if you have multiple devices, you could have multiple cards. So I have an Apple Watch that I wear as well as an Apple iPhone. I can set up 10 payment cards on one device and 10 different payment cards on a secondary device. And I find this to be extremely useful. This is useful so that you can make transactions if you don't have your wallet with you. I take great pleasure of being at the pool or being at the resort and in the hot tub, and I can just wear my watch and have no worries about it having a problem, and I can swim over to the bar and pay for my drinks without a problem. That's fantastic. It's really nice to have that feature. And so there's convenience there. It's also convenience in terms of having access to multiple cards. So let's say that you are a mileage hacker and you are trying to pay with this card for this thing and this card for that thing. Well, you have to carry around this giant wallet, or you can just use Apple Pay. I've even done this myself when I've done various mileage hacking games, and all of my credit cards get mailed to my physical address in the United States, but I'm not there. And it gets really annoying to be FedExing your cards all around the world. Well, it's no longer necessary. All I need is for somebody to open my mail, snag me my card numbers. I go ahead and add those card numbers to my devices, and now I can accomplish any relevant minimum spending requirements that I want to make to those cards, and it's very simple and easy for me to do that without actually having the physical card. This is a big advantage. And if you're someone who runs, let's say you have a personal debit card and a personal credit card, a business debit card and a business credit card, or if you have multiple accounts for different kinds of expenditures. I teach this technique of having multiple debit card accounts for different kinds of spending. And so it's really convenient when you can just tap on your watch or phone, pull up that relevant card, and make your payment. So there are big benefits here. And finally, I would point out that there are big benefits here from a safety perspective. Even if you don't want to use these payment methods consistently, you should still have them available to you in an emergency, at least one. I think you should take your phone and go ahead and set up at least one card on your phone or your watch or your digital devices, so that if you are stranded somewhere without a payment methodology, you can probably still use your card. I travel a good bit. A lot of times when traveling, our stuff gets stolen. And obviously, this is a concern of the device being stolen. Theoretically, there are problems here that if you now have 10 cards on your device and somebody is torturing you to give up your passcode, can you rack up 10 cards? Yeah, that could be something. But I don't think that cell phones are getting stolen as much as they once were, especially if they're older and cheaper, and you don't need to have 10 cards on there. And I don't think that many people are in the habit of going around and torturing people for their card numbers. It does happen. I am aware of it happening, but it's not a common risk. So let's pull back to kind of the mainstream. The more probable scenario is simply that you lose your cards, or your wallet, your card gets pickpocketed. That's a bigger problem because you can't track that. Yes, you could have a wallet with an Apple AirTag in it or some version of that, but the device itself is always putting out those signals. And so to have this payment methodology available to you if you lose your cards or have other problems is really, really valuable. And so I think that if you find yourself in a situation where having multiple methods of payment is something that you care about, then you should absolutely have this set up as a backup. I make certain that on all the devices, there's at least one or two cards set up. You choose the cards. Remember that you still have all of the fraudulent transaction protection on these devices as you would with anything else. So you do, right? I'm pretty sure you do. Although I just realized as I say that I've never actually verified that. So let me back up and just say I believe that everything, all of the fraud protections that we are accustomed to in our credit card agreements still apply. So if fraudulent transactions were committed with your device, you are still protected. So I think that as a backup, you should have at least 1 or 2 empty credit cards that are tied to your device. And even if you're not going to use this as a regular way of paying, having it available to you when you need it can be something that is quite valuable to you. That concludes what I want to say. What should you do? Well, if you use credit cards, and there are some in this audience who don't for very good reasons. If you use credit cards or debit cards or even prepaid debit cards, which I'm a big fan of, then go ahead and take the time to set these systems up with your Apple Pay or with your Google Pay so that you can get enhanced privacy, enhanced security, and access when you need it and enhanced convenience. This concludes what I have to share with you. As we go, I want to remind you that I am in the early weeks of Radical Personal Finance Academy. If you are interested in anything related to money, I think you're going to be interested in my academy. Just this last week, we did the first live course. It wound up being 3 hours on the live call where I taught about balance sheets. We talked about mindset of money and also balance sheets this last week. This coming weekend, I will be presenting the next module where we're talking about income statements. Then we'll be digging into an analysis of those income statements. And as part of the process, I'm going to give the students of my course my comprehensive flowchart of basically how to spend money. I know it sounds silly. Maybe you just have it all figured out, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about some ways to spend money that fix many of the problems that many people have. I find all the time when I'm consulting with people, make plenty of money, no major crises, but they're just like, I can't get a hold on my spending. And I don't think that people like that are ever going to be zero-based budgeters where you're going to sit down and do that. So I've created new systems that solve all these problems so you don't wind up with a big fat credit card bill at the end of the month. I've even created systems that I'm going to share with my students, things I've never talked about on the show, of how do you actually keep track of things easily in a store. So, where I spend more money than anywhere else is Costco. I go to Costco and it just piles up, and it can be a budget buster, right? The difference between, say, a $400 Costco run, kind of a normal one, and an $800 Costco run is about a half a cart. And so having an easy way to tally that stuff and total that stuff is really important, especially if you're trying to make certain that you don't overspend. You're trying to stick to a certain number. So even just the techniques that I will teach my students starting in about 3 weeks of how to track your transactions in the store, I think will, so that you know when you pull up to the register exactly what the price is super easily. I think these little techniques can help people save hundreds of dollars. And that's in addition to all the stuff I'm teaching that can be thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in returns. So if that sounds interesting to you and you haven't joined yet, please go to rpfacademy.com and join now. And all this year, you'll be able to access the live classes rather than the recorded classes in the future. So go to rpfacademy.com, sign up today, rpfacademy.com.